On the morning of July 9th, 1982, a Boeing 727 aircraft sat on the runway at New Orleans International Airport, ready for departure. The weather was poor. Thunderstorms dotted the landscape, and the sky hung gray and heavy.
Inside the cabin were 145 passengers and 9 crew members. They were heading to Fort Lauderdale, Florida for what should have been a routine 1-hour flight.
Nobody on that aircraft knew that the next 4 minutes would change aviation safety forever.
But because of something invisible, something that meteorologists had theorized about but never fully understood.
Something that was about to claim 153 lives and spark a scientific...
That tragedy sparked a revolution in aviation meteorology that would save thousands more in the decades to come.
This is the true story of Pan American Flight 759. In 1927, a visionary entrepreneur named Juan Trippe founded an airline that would become more than just a commercial venture. It would become a symbol of American ambition and global connectivity. Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am as it was commonly known, started small, with a single seaplane flying between Florida and Cuba. But under Trippe's leadership, Pan Am grew into something truly extraordinary. By the 1930s and 1940s, Pan Am had become the world's largest international airline, operating routes that literally connected continents. They pioneered transoceanic flights when aviation was still a novelty, bringing luxury and comfort to air travel on a scale that had never been seen before. Their aircraft became icons, the flying boats of the 1930s and 1940s, and later, the legendary Boeing 707 jets that revolutionized transatlantic travel. By 1958, Pan Am had launched the world's first commercial jet service across the Atlantic, and their reputation for safety, reliability, and elegance was unmatched in the aviation industry. However, by 1982, Pan American Airways was facing significant challenges. The airline industry had been deregulated by the US government in 1978, which meant new competition and price pressure. Fuel costs had skyrocketed following the oil crisis of the 1970s. Pan Am, despite its legendary status, was struggling financially, yet the company maintained its commitment to safety and professionalism. The airline's safety record was among the best in the world. Passengers trusted Pan Am not because it was the cheapest option, but because it represented stability, experience, and a company that had been flying safely across oceans for over 50 years. The pilots who flew for Pan Am were among the most experienced and respected in the industry. The aircraft in their fleet were well maintained, and the company's training standards were rigorous. On that July morning in 1982, there was every reason to believe that Flight 759 would be just another safe, routine operation. The Boeing 727 represented a remarkable achievement in aircraft design. First introduced in 1963, it became one of the most successful commercial aircraft ever built. Over 1,100 of them would eventually be produced, a record that stood for many years. The 727 was a unique design, powered by 3 Pratt & Whitney JT8D turbofan engines, which gave it a significant safety advantage. Unlike the 2-engine jets that were becoming more common, the 727's 3-engine configuration meant that the aircraft could continue flying safely, even if one engine failed. This redundancy was particularly valued by airlines operating from smaller airports or remote regions, where landing options were limited. The aircraft could cruise at speeds up to Mach 0.89, nearly 605 miles per hour, and had a range of 1,500 to 2,500 miles, making it ideal for both short regional flights and longer transcontinental journeys. It could carry between 157 and 189 passengers, and it required a crew of 3 pilots, a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer, plus cabin crew to serve the passengers. The specific aircraft involved in Flight 759 was a Boeing 727-235 with the registration number N4713. This aircraft had been manufactured in 1967, making it 15 years old at the time of the accident. For commercial aviation standards of that era, it was a well-maintained aircraft in the prime of its operational life. Pan American Airways had taken excellent care of this aircraft, and it carried the highest standards of Pan Am engineering and maintenance. The 727 was particularly well-suited to Pan Am's operations, offering a perfect balance of capability, economy, and passenger comfort, that defined the airline's brand. The aircraft had a clean safety record with Pan Am, and there was nothing in its maintenance logs to suggest any problems. All systems were functioning normally on the morning of July 9th. The engines were producing full power as designed, the hydraulic systems were properly pressurized, and the flight control surfaces responded smoothly to input. This was not a question of a faulty or aging aircraft. This was one of the most reliable aircraft, operated by one of the world's most careful airlines, flown by experienced pilots. What happened next had nothing to do with the machine itself. The route from New Orleans Moisant International Airport, MSY, to Fort Lauderdale International Airport, FLL, was a routine domestic flight covering approximately 420 miles with an expected flight time of about 1 hour and 15 minutes. This was a well-traveled route operated daily by multiple airlines. Thousands of passengers flew this route every year without incident. From a navigation standpoint, it was straightforward, a departure from Louisiana heading southeast toward Florida. From a weather standpoint, it was considerably more challenging. New Orleans in July is one of the hottest, most humid places in the continental United States. The city sits near the mouth of the Mississippi River on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. The combination of land, water, heat, and moisture creates an ideal breeding ground for afternoon thunderstorms. During the summer months, thunderstorms are not occasional events. They are expected. Pilots flying out of New Orleans in summer are trained to expect convective weather, to recognize thunderstorm development, and to plan accordingly. The airport itself is used to dealing with these conditions. Air traffic controllers have experience routing aircraft around or between developing storms. But in July 1982, the science of predicting and detecting the most dangerous aspects of thunderstorms was far less advanced than it would become in later years. Fort Lauderdale, the destination, is one of Florida's major tourist destinations. In July, it is hot, humid, and frequently the site of afternoon thunderstorms as well. Passengers choosing to fly this route in summer are generally those with schedules that demand it. Business travelers, families on vacation, and those with connections to other flights. Many of them had made this flight dozens of times before. The morning of July 9th, like thousands of mornings before it, seemed to promise nothing unusual beyond the typical summer weather challenges that all pilots operating in this region routinely encountered. The scheduled departure time for Flight 759 was 4:03 in the morning, an unusually early time that reflected the operational needs of a connecting flight network. Early morning departures are common in aviation, allowing aircraft to complete multiple flights in a single operational day and ensuring that passengers with connections are delivered on schedule. The aircraft actually departed at 4:08 in the morning, and the eastern seaboard of Florida was 1 hour ahead, operating on Eastern Daylight Time. The weather situation at New Orleans Moisant International Airport on the morning of July 9th, 1982, was unsettled, but not unusual for the season. The temperature was approximately 75 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity above 85%. Wind conditions were variable, ranging from about 20 to 25 knots. Visibility was reduced to about 3 miles due to the presence of thunderstorms in the area. The National Weather Service had issued a SIGMET, significant meteorological information, advising of thunderstorms and occasional heavy rain in the region. By modern standards, these conditions would warrant careful consideration and perhaps flight delays. By 1982 standards, they were considered acceptable for a well-equipped aircraft and experienced crew, though cautious. The airport remained open for operations, and the Federal Aviation Administration continued to issue clearances for both departures and arrivals, with the assumption that aircraft would maneuver around the worst of the weather. On the morning of July 9th, 1982, a severe thunderstorm system was developing over the New Orleans area. This was not an unusual event for July in Louisiana. Severe thunderstorms in summer are common. What made this particular thunderstorm system dangerous was a specific meteorological phenomenon that was occurring within it. This phenomenon had a name. Meteorologists called it a downburst, or more specifically, a microburst. But in 1982, even the term was not yet widely known outside of meteorological research circles. The general public, and even many professional pilots, had never heard of a microburst. It was a relatively new area of research, and the scientific community was still working to fully understand how microbursts formed, how intense they could become, and how dangerous they were to aircraft in flight. A thunderstorm develops when warm, moist air rises rapidly into the atmosphere. As this air rises, it cools, and the water vapor condenses into water droplets and ice crystals, forming clouds. The growth of these clouds is powered by the release of latent heat, energy released when water vapor condenses into liquid. In a severe thunderstorm, this process can be incredibly intense, creating updrafts of air that can exceed 100 miles per hour. Inside the towering cloud, millions of water droplets and ice crystals form. Precipitation. Rain and hail begins to develop. But as precipitation falls within the cloud, it encounters drier air below the cloud base. When rain and hail fall through this drier air, it evaporates and melts, respectively. This evaporation and melting process extracts energy from the surrounding air, cooling it significantly. Cold air is denser than warm air and therefore heavier. The precipitation-laden air becomes so heavy that it can no longer be supported by the updrafts. Instead, this cold, heavy air begins to descend rapidly. When this descending air reaches the ground, it can't continue downward, so it spreads outward horizontally in all directions, creating a violent outburst of wind that can exceed 200 miles per hour, equal to the winds of a powerful tornado, but spreading outward rather than rotating. This phenomenon is a microburst, and it is an exceptionally dangerous situation for an aircraft near the ground.
During takeoff or landing, the most critical phases of flight, it represents an almost unrecoverable emergency.
A microburst represents almost an unrecoverable emergency. In July 1982, this threat was largely invisible to the aviation community. Weather radar of that era could detect rain and intense reflectivity associated with storms. But the violent wind shear associated with microbursts was not reliably detected. Pilots had no warning systems to alert them to the presence of a microburst.
For a Boeing 727 at low altitude, facing the full force of the microburst, the point of impossibility was rapidly approaching.
The microburst had a diameter of only a few hundred meters, a relatively small area. But within that area, it contained winds of extraordinary violence and a downward component of wind, a downburst that could be 30, 40, or even 50 miles per hour downward. For an aircraft attempting to climb after takeoff, this downward wind is catastrophic. The aircraft must overcome not only gravity, but also this powerful downward wind to achieve altitude. The situation is analogous to trying to swim upstream against a powerful river current while also swimming upward. At some point, if the current is strong enough and the swimmer is not strong enough, progress becomes impossible. And for a Boeing 727 at low altitude with moderate engine thrust, facing the full force of a microburst, that point of impossibility was rapidly approaching. What follows is a detailed reconstruction of the 4 minutes that changed aviation safety forever. This timeline is based on data recovered from the flight data recorder, the black box. Sykes, Kommunikationshoist, voice communications recorded by the cockpit voice recorder, radar data from air traffic control, and careful scientific analysis by investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board. Every detail that can be known about what happened inside that cockpit and in the atmosphere around that aircraft has been analyzed, cross-referenced, and verified. This is the most complete and accurate account possible of how Flight 759's flight crew fought against an invisible force and how that force ultimately prevailed. Captain Robert Loft sat in the left seat of the Boeing 727. He was 55 years old and had been flying for Pan American Airways for 18 years. Over his career, he had accumulated more than 10,000 hours of flight time, a figure that placed him in the highest tier of experienced commercial pilots. His first officer, Gerald Wheaton, was younger, but also highly trained and experienced. The flight engineer, Philip K. Son, occupied the third seat in the cockpit. These were not novice pilots. These were among the most experienced and respected pilots in the entire Pan American fleet. Captain Loft had successfully flown aircraft through countless challenging weather situations. He had been trained extensively in wind shear recognition and recovery, as all Pan Am captains were. He understood the temperamental behavior of thunderstorms. He knew how to interpret weather radar displays. By any measure, this was an exceptionally well-qualified crew about to operate a well-maintained aircraft. At 4:08 in the morning, with the engines running at idle and all pre-takeoff checks completed, Captain Loft made contact with the New Orleans Air Traffic Control Tower. New Orleans ground, Pan Am 759 is ready to push back, he transmitted. The tower controller, who had been monitoring the weather situation and the radar display, reviewed the aircraft's position and the current conditions. The runway was clear of other traffic. The winds were within acceptable limits. The visibility, while reduced, was adequate for takeoff. The tower controller made his decision. Pan Am 759, runway 10 left, cleared for takeoff. This was a routine clearance. The controller had no indication that this takeoff was about to become anything other than routine. Captain Loft advanced the 3 throttles to the takeoff position. On the flight engineer's panel, all 3 engines came alive, spooling up to their full takeoff thrust rating. The engines on a Boeing 727 are reliable workhorses, and that morning they performed exactly as designed. The aircraft began to roll forward down runway 10 left. The speed began to increase. 20 knots, 30 knots, 40 knots. The aircraft accelerated smoothly down the runway, gathering speed as it should, with no indication of any problem. The flight instruments glowed in front of the pilots, displaying all green indications. The airspeed indicator needle began its gradual rise toward the rotation speed of approximately 154 knots. Everything was proceeding normally. At an airspeed of 154 knots, Captain Loft made a call out: rotate. This is standard phraseology used when the aircraft has reached the speed at which the nose should be raised to transition from ground roll to flight. First Officer Wheaton pulled back smoothly on the control column, raising the nose of the aircraft to a pitch angle of approximately 12 to 15 degrees. The nose wheel left the runway surface. At 4:09 and 15 seconds, the main landing gear also left the runway. Flight 759 was airborne. Positive rate ID, called the flight engineer, confirming that the aircraft was achieving a positive rate of climb and could retract the landing gear. The landing gear retraction sequence began immediately. The aircraft continued upward at what appeared to be a normal climb rate of approximately 800 feet per minute, which is exactly what would be expected for a Boeing 727 at this weight and configuration. As the aircraft climbed away from the runway at an altitude of perhaps 200 to 300 feet, something remarkable was happening in the atmosphere around it. The aircraft was encountering strong headwind, wind blowing directly opposite to the direction of flight. This headwind was actually beneficial for the takeoff. A headwind increases the effective airspeed of the aircraft relative to the ground, making the aircraft feel faster through the air and improving its climbing performance. This was the beginning of the aircraft's encounter with the microburst. The microburst's outflow winds were producing a pronounced headwind component, and this headwind, ironically, was temporarily helping the aircraft climb. The indicated airspeed showed approximately 108 knots, which was healthy. The altitude was increasing steadily. The climb rate was good. From the perspective of the pilots, everything appeared to be proceeding normally. They had no way of knowing that the wind field they were about to enter was beginning to transition from a favorable headwind to a potentially deadly tailwind. At an altitude of approximately 500 to 600 feet, something changed. Captain Loft felt it first, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the behavior of the aircraft. The climb was becoming sluggish. The aircraft was still climbing, but not as robustly as it should be. The vertical speed indicator, which had shown a healthy positive climb rate of perhaps 800 feet per minute just moments before, was now indicating a reduced climb rate of only 400 to 500 feet per minute, and it was dropping further. At 4:10 and 0 seconds, Captain Loft made an urgent observation. "We're getting sheer here." His voice in the cockpit voice recording carries a note of concern, but not yet panic. This was a professional's recognition of an unusual situation. What was actually happening was a fundamental change in the wind field. The headwind that had been benefiting the aircraft was beginning to diminish. The transition zone between the headwind area and the tailwind area was beginning to affect the aircraft. As headwind decreases or transitions to tailwind, the indicated airspeed decreases, even if the true airspeed, the aircraft's actual speed through the air relative to the ground, remains relatively constant. The indicated airspeed is what the pilots read on their instruments, and it is the indicated airspeed that determines whether an aircraft is flying at a safe margin above stall speed. Stall speed for a Boeing 727 in takeoff configuration is approximately 95 knots. At this moment, the indicated airspeed was still healthy at perhaps 108 knots, but the trend was downward, and it was downward more steeply than would be normal during a climb. Captain Loft's immediate response was to increase the pitch angle, to point the nose of the aircraft more steeply upward. This is the natural and correct response to a decreasing climb rate. More pitch angle should create more lift and a more positive climb. But in this situation, that response was fighting against forces that individual pilot inputs could not overcome. The downward wind component of the microburst was now exerting its full force on the aircraft. The aircraft was being pushed downward by an invisible force of great magnitude. Engines running at full thrust, responding to the pilot's control inputs, could not compensate for the intensity of the wind shear. By 4:10 and 30 seconds, the situation had become critical. The altitude was approximately 800 to 900 feet, but the rate of climb had deteriorated to only 200 feet per minute, less than 1/4 of the normal climb rate. The aircraft was still climbing, but barely. The pitch angle had been increased to approximately 9 to 10 degrees, still not approaching a dangerous stall angle, but higher than would normally be necessary at this phase of the climb. Captain Loft, with the confidence born of 18 years with Pan Am and 10,000 hours of flight time, issued clear commands to his crew. Go ahead. Push it up. He was instructing his first officer to maintain maximum thrust on the engines, but the engines were already at maximum thrust. There was no more power available to add. First Officer Wheaton and Flight Engineer Kaysen were monitoring the engine instruments intently. Engines in the green. Full thrust applied, reported the flight engineer. The Pratt & Whitney engines were performing exactly as designed, producing their rated maximum thrust. But the power being produced by those engines, while substantial, was insufficient to overcome the downward wind component of the microburst. This was not a situation that additional pilot skill, additional engine power, or additional altitude could immediately remedy. This was a situation where the aircraft was caught between two opposing forces: gravity and the powerful downburst wind pushing downward versus the engines pushing upward and forward. The engines were not losing the battle. The aircraft was still maintaining altitude and even gaining altitude, albeit slowly, but gaining enough altitude to escape the microburst entirely was becoming questionable. The vertical speed indicator continued its downward trend. Climb rate dropped to 100 feet per minute. The indicated airspeed continued to fall. It was now approximately 100 to 105 knots with a downward trend. Stall speed was 95 knots, leaving a margin of only 5 to 10 knots. In aviation, this is an uncomfortably small margin. Pilots prefer to maintain a comfortable buffer above stall speed, typically 15 to 20 knots or more. But Flight 759 was being squeezed into an increasingly narrow envelope. The pilots were acutely aware of this. They were working the controls actively, adjusting pitch, monitoring airspeed, and fighting the wind shear. Their training and experience told them what to do. Maintain. The NTSB's official finding regarding the probable cause of the accident was stated with clear and specific language. The report stated, the probable cause of this accident was the aircraft's penetration of a wind shear condition, which was a downburst type microburst. The rapid decrease in airspeed, coincident with the aircraft's attempt to climb through this microburst type wind shear layer, resulted in a marginal climb performance situation, such that the aircraft was unable to climb and eventually struck the ground. This statement captured in technical language the essential facts of what had happened. The aircraft had encountered a microburst. The microburst had caused a severe wind shear condition. This wind shear had reduced the aircraft's climb capability below what was necessary for safe flight, and the result had been a loss of altitude and eventual impact with the ground. The significance of this finding extended beyond just identifying what had caused the accident. The finding also implicitly acknowledged something that was not explicitly stated, but was understood by all parties. That Flight 759 was not an isolated or extraordinary incident caused by some unique combination of circumstances. Rather, it was representative of a class of accidents that could be prevented through systematic identification and mitigation of the wind shear hazard. The NTSB's finding essentially served as a wake-up call to the aviation community. There is a serious weather hazard that you have not adequately prepared for, and the time to prepare is now. Beyond the immediate cause of the accident, the microburst wind shear, the NTSB report identified several contributing factors. The first and most significant contributing factor was the complete absence of wind shear detection and warning systems. In 1982, there was no technology available to predict or detect microbursts. Weather radar could detect rain, but rain detection and wind shear detection are different problems. The weather radar available at New Orleans Airport was not designed for or capable of detecting wind shear. Be enhanced to include specific instruction on microbursts. A third contributing factor was the lack of standard operating procedures for operating in wind shear. In 1982, had done their jobs correctly and had responded appropriately to a situation that was beyond their control. But the loss was no less profound. The families of the passengers had no such consolation. For them, the accident served as a reminder that despite all our technology and training, there remain natural forces that can be more powerful than human capability to overcome. The New Orleans community, particularly the residents of the area where the aircraft crashed, experienced their own trauma. The sight of the burning wreckage, the loss of neighbors and friends, and the realization that they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, left scars that would take time to heal. Yet from this tragedy came an important legacy. The investigation into Flight 759 And the safety improvements, the number is surely in the thousands. The passengers and crew of Flight 759 did not die in vain. Their tragedy served as a powerful impetus for systematic improvements that have made air travel safer for everyone who has flown since that day.